Go somewhere later where it's But it won't fly.
Humans don't necessarily behave as rationally as you might expect.
Most people think emergency happens, people react very quickly and they start to... They don't do that.
Authority says, oh, there's nothing to worry about, and just stay where you are, and you trust them, and then it's too late to evacuate.
When you actually start to react, that's a matter of when you have a sufficient amount of signals.
Maybe you have 10 minutes and you don't understand. What can you do? You wait for more information. Then maybe your possibilities to survive is over.
My name is Anders Norén. I have been interested in tunnel fire safety. It's not acceptable to have big consequences if there is a fire, so we need to come up with good solutions. We were lucky to be able to carry out tests. People were not aware that they would be involved. HGV, a lorry simply, going into the tunnel, and it was followed by approximately 50 drivers. This lorry suddenly stops. Smoke starts coming from the lorry. The drivers in the other cars were thinking probably that there was some kind of incident. If there is a fire and the traffic has stopped in front of you, then yes, evacuate and evacuate directly. They remain in the car and look at what happens. The most important finding was that the group behavior is very, very important. Then hesitation time. When you actually start to react, that's a matter of when you have a sufficient amount of signals. Only after somebody else reacts, then you will also react. In the first stage, just waiting. Then you can spend a quite long time hesitating, but then suddenly you start to evacuate, and that's a very short stage. I think it's part of the human nature that we define ourselves as a member of a group in certain occasions. And if we do that, then we tend to observe the behavior of others. And we want our behavior to be just as it should in the group.
다섯 명의 남자가 들어옵니다. 이 사람의 행동을 보기 위한 실험. 손의 길이가 같은 걸 찾을 겁니다. 돌아가면서 한 명씩 답을 말할 겁니다.
The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example,
연구팀과 짠 4명의 연기자들은 일부러 틀린 답을 고를 겁니다. 이번 문제의 정답은 2번.
One.
Two.
One.
역시 정답은 2번.
Three. Three.
This study is one of the first classic studies on the power of a group. As long as there's 3 or more people who agree among themselves that reality is not the way you see it, in many cases you give in to see the world in their way. But now, what happens when you're in a situation where if you don't act, there could be a risk to your life?
한 여성이 사람들 속에 앉아 있습니다. 잠시 후 화재 경보가 울립니다. 하지만 사람들은 자리에 그냥 앉아 있습니다. 시간은 계속 흐릅니다. 20분이 지나 누군가 와서 나가라고 하자 그때서야 자리를 뜹니다. 혼자 있을 때는 어떨까요? 연기를 확인하고 가방도 버려둔 채 곧장 밖으로 나갑니다.
The fire disasters have often occurred because people have sort of insufficient information, and then the fire develops very rapidly, and by the time they then decide to evacuate, they don't have sufficient time left to do so. They will tend to stick together and come to a sort of common decision as to what they will do, so slow down the decision of the group to leave. We also get interactions between strangers as well. In order to get the correct risk calculation, you need to know how people will react in response to it. They may try and rescue their luggage, for example. That's another thing that sort of happens more frequently in a tunnel fire. Than also, they are reluctant to leave their vehicles behind. It's an unusual thing to do, really. So quite often what you would find is that people would be preferring to drive back out of the tunnel if they could, rather than just leave the car behind and evacuate on foot. But you have to always think of it from the perspective of the person involved, and they are in a confusing situation or a situation where it's unclear that anything is necessarily happening.
One key aspect in evacuations is to decide where to go and when to go. And that is, if you're in a group, that's an example of a group decision. Ultimately, the behavior of humans and animals as a result of their evolutionary history. And what we were particularly interested in is the mechanism of how information is transmitted within groups from one individual to the next. If you're in a very busy street and there's people coming, walking in both directions along that street, we find that lanes form in the street, so that people follow lanes. And that's another good example for collective behavior, because no one has told the pedestrians to do that. It's just from their interactions that this phenomenon emerges.
One of the key questions that we're trying to investigate with this project is what information do individuals follow?
The fundamental question is whether every individual in the group just reacts to the stimulus, or whether individuals react to other individuals within the group.
But simply by staying together, it's less likely that some of them will wander off completely in the wrong direction, and by staying together, that overall they all do a bit better than they would individually.
What we did in the experiment was we placed a group of fish, 50 fish, inside an experimental tank. So it's the same experiment? Every fish in the group had been trained to react to the light. So the very first fish that moved probably just spotted the light first. Yeah? It was the first one to spot the light and move towards it. So some fish may have spotted the light, whereas other fish have just spotted that other fish are moving quickly in a particular direction, and then they follow them. In the negative stimulus example, individuals paid attention to the rate of change of individuals that started to move towards, away from the stimulus. So that's a more sort of dynamic information.
What we have is they follow each other without necessarily reacting to the environment around them. They would give more emphasis on following each other. I think it's a key thing that clearly, certainly animals and probably humans as well, like to stay together in groups. Quite a large group of individuals to go the wrong way in an evacuation, when only a small number were basically told to go the wrong way. Everyone else followed them because they weren't responding to what was the real signal. They were responding to what other members of the group were doing incorrectly. A step-by-step process. We just need to understand how individuals react in these pressure situations, in these in crowded situations. How far they would go to stay in the group while also putting themselves in danger is something that we want to try and investigate, because it's very important, obviously has important safety implications for evacuations.
사고는 언제든 일어날 수 있습니다. 그리고 시간과의 싸움이 시작됩니다.
I think it's really difficult to predict how humans will react in an emergency situation. We all know how we like to think that we would react, and then when an event happens, some people will exceed expectations and others will not perform the way you'd expect them to. If there was the need to evacuate an aircraft, perhaps because it was on fire, if it's obvious to the people on the aircraft, then you will tend to get a very fast reaction where passengers in particular do absolutely the thing you don't want them to, which is take their baggage with them. One incident where the aircraft landed, there was a fire, and there was a single cabin crew member on the aircraft, and she called for people to evacuate, and everybody on the aircraft just stood up to get their bags out of the overhead. And so she said it again, and she was still ignored. So in the end, she swore at people and screamed, and then they got off the aeroplane. It's unfortunately quite normal that people behave like that. It's partly because it's what you do at the end of every flight. So the normal learned routine behaviour is to get your belongings as you leave. In the UK in the mid-1980s, there was an aircraft accident that happened at Manchester Airport in which 55 people were killed in what should have been a survivable accident. There was no impact, so people didn't have broken legs or broken arms, so they should have been able to move off the aeroplane. But still, people didn't get out of the aircraft in time. And as a consequence of that, there was a lot of research done here to understand why humans behave the way they do. Incentivised people to be the first off the aeroplane. If someone was paid £5 to participate in the trial, then the first 20 people off the aircraft received £10. What it created was that strong incentive for people to be off the aeroplane first. And on many occasions we had to stop the experiments because people became trapped in the exits and that no one was getting off the aeroplane. And if there's smoke in the cabin, then very quickly it can become a very difficult environment for people to see or to breathe, and quickly people can lose consciousness. So even now, some airlines will suggest that a passenger might count the number of seats between them and the exit. Well, that advice came because the last person to survive the Manchester fire did so in thick black smoke. They couldn't even see their hand, but they'd counted the number of seats to the exit, and they felt their way to where they knew the exit was, and they fell out the aeroplane.
You know, the ship is sinking. It's a unique experience. Fortunately, not that many people experience a maritime disaster.
오스카 에릭스는 경제학자입니다.
Economics point of view, people act rationally. When you're faced the risk of dying, it would be most rational to try to save yourself. However, we also know that people are governed by social norms. Social norms on the one hand and rationality on the other hand is interesting to study from an economics point of view. The most famous maritime disasters in history is the sinking of the Titanic. What was important on Titanic, he gave the order to evacuate women and children first. Disobedience from this order was threatened with violence. The crew shot at men who tried to get into the lifeboats before women and children. We have come to symbolize this protocol of women and children first. Do the crew help passengers in those situations? So we collected data on a total number of 18 maritime disasters. We saw a stunning pattern that the crew survived to a much higher extent than do passengers. It seems like the crew don't follow their duties. Captains seem to survive to a higher degree than males and females on board those ships. So almost 40% of the captains actually survive. We can always have stricter rules for the crew, how they should behave. But with the risk of dying, the instinct is stronger than the risk of penalty from misbehaving. Even harsher penalties for crews back in the 19th century than it is today, but still they behaved as they do today, and that's human behavior. Behavior of these crew members and the captain on board Sea Hall doesn't seem to be exceptional. You know, it fits into the pattern that we have seen over history. the crew abandons before the passengers. That's a tragedy. It has happened before and will probably happen in the future as well, which is tragic, of course. More research is definitely needed. Brains should be gathered and discuss those issues because, as I said, these kinds of events will happen in the future.
When the World Trade Center was attacked, the same advice was given. People should stay at your desks, nothing to worry about. The expression "don't panic" is usually intended to make people more calm, and there's a kind of assumption about crowd reactions to emergencies and disasters, which is like an off-the-shelf cliche that is readily mobilised whenever these things occur. If you say that crowds panic, then the implication might be that the responses of the emergency services or the government might be to do things that would prevent that panic. But it also has consequences as an assumption, especially if used by those with responsibility for crowd safety and emergency response. You don't need to worry, everyone, you don't need to worry, it's fine. Not giving information, because they think, well, the crowd will panic, we can't tell them, or giving information which backfires. Don't panic. They're assuming that crowds overreact to danger, right? Then that gives them a reason to withhold information. We had a terrorist attack in London a number of years ago in which 52 people were killed. Now that took place during the rush hour. People in the underground trains that were affected were amongst strangers. Cooperation and social support was very common. Emergency changes relations between people. It changes them from just being individuals to being a psychological group, and that therefore drives behaviour, including helping behaviour, because you see others, right, as like you, and you care about their interests. And the authorities have the right understanding about how people behave in emergencies so that they're able to give them the right information rather than trying to change the group psychology. I don't think that people need advice on how to feel, on their emotions. Advice on their emotions is either useless if people are already anxious, in preventing people from underreacting to emergencies.
The accident was in 1994, in September. It was in autumn here in Sweden, and it was very cold. The ship was going from Estonia to Sweden, Stockholm, and it was sinking in between. I didn't have a cabin because I was a student, and so I wanted to save my money, so I was actually sleeping on a sofa in a cafeteria. And that in the middle of the night I was waking up, there were some noises, some big bang. I could just feel that something was very wrong because they immediately started a list. It was just some grades, but I could feel it in the whole body. And things were moving from one side to the other side. Then I felt that I felt sick and that I needed to get out. And I wanted to get out as fast as possible, and I wanted to get as high as possible also. I had to climb 2 floors up in order to get out on the deck. When I left this cafeteria, I noticed that there was only 3 other people. We were not so many people coming out.
승객 980명 가운데 850여 명이 목숨을 잃었습니다.
For me, the hardest moments that night, it was when I didn't know what to do. And the list was getting worse and worse, but it was too early to jump into the water. And I didn't know what to do. The information I got was that those 2 people that was working on the ship, they were saying to everyone, don't worry, this ship can't sink. Don't worry, this ship can't sink. It was comforting that they were telling us that someone was acting in this situation, but I didn't really believe them. The information for me was that the list was getting worse. You could hear the whole body of the ship was and you could feel it in your whole body. For me that was enough information. And then later on I overhear a conversation. It was a crew member. He was talking in a walkie-talkie and he said that there is water everywhere. I don't go down there again. That was information for me that I understood that this is really, really bad. We were walking on the side of the ship, me and some other people. It was like, it felt sometimes like a bad movie. That, you know, you can't walk on a ship like that. But then again, I was walking on the ship. And I was thinking about my family. I was thinking about my mom and dad, and I wished so hard that I was somewhere else, that I was sitting together with them at the dinner table having dinner, and that I wanted to meet my friends and so. But that actually took focus from where I were. And if I should have stayed in this thinking, I wouldn't have survived, because then I had lost the time and I should have missed the possibilities to get away. I tried to help also to take down a life boat, but the angle was so hard, so we couldn't really winch it down. It was not possible. So I didn't know what to do. And that moment for me, it was the worst. It was taking a very short time, and when I was in the water fighting for my life and I could see actually the ship was sinking, like 10 minutes to get out of there, then it was too late. When it comes to evacuation, people prioritize being together with the families or make sure that they are safe before they evacuate themselves. And that when you have this too much stress, you both get very much sharper in your brain, but you get also more difficulties making decisions. You act automatically. It's not that you have time to do a big analyze. It depends on how the individual feel that you have the possibilities to actually do some action. If you, for example, if you don't understand the situation, maybe you have 10 minutes and you don't understand. What can you do? You wait for more information. Then maybe your possibilities to survive is over. We can do a lot. And I mean basic training, help people how to do an evacuation. Assist other people, encourage them to move out. Don't sit, don't wait. You can do a lot. For me, I think it's like when it just happened, if I think back to that situation in Estonia, I would appreciate it more people actually doing more active approach, saying, helping, shouting, showing very clearly what to do and how to do it.
And one of the things we were interested in is how long does it take people to react to begin the evacuation process. We call this time response time. This is the time from when the incident starts and when people are notified that they know something is going on. From that point, how long does it take them to actually start to evacuate? Now, most people think that when the alarm goes off or an emergency happens, people react very quickly and they start to evacuate. They don't do that. They tend to try and gather information. Is that a real alarm? Is that a false alarm? Is this a drill? Maybe it's an alarm for somebody else. So they gather information. They go and talk to people. We found people get on the phone. And the other thing they tend to do is they do what we call activity tasks. So they go and they shut down the computer. They file things away. They will go to the filing cabinet to put things away. They will go and collect items. They might go and change their shoes. They go and pick up their bags. So they do a lot of these activities, and this slows down the process of the evacuation. And so the response phase of an evacuation is actually very complex. People are doing lots of things before they actually engage in the evacuation process. And it's very important to understand this, because in many cases, the time it takes people to react can be longer than the time it takes them to actually evacuate. So it's very important that we understand this response phase behavior. We've been doing lots of work on large cruise ships and passenger ferries. We've been interested to see how long it takes people to begin to start the evacuation process on ships. They knew there was going to be a drill, but they didn't know when. It was quasi-unannounced, and it was done at sea. And they were real passengers. So we had old people, we had young people, we had children, we had a whole mixture of people on board the ship. One of the things we found in the experiments was that the passengers on cruise ships behave differently to the passengers in ferries. They take longer to react. The people on cruise ships tended to take longer to react, I think simply because on a cruise ship you are almost treating the ship as your home, and you settle into the ship, and you don't expect to have to leave the ship very soon. Whereas on a ferry is more of a mode of transport to get from point A to point B, and you expect to get there relatively soon, and you expect to leave. So people are more prepared to leave off the ferry than they are on the cruise ship. So I think that's part of the reason that there was a difference in the type of response time. But it's important that we understand what these people that are taking a long time, what it is that they're doing, and why they're taking a long time. One of the things we found, especially on the ferries, is that passengers tend to take a long time to react if they are in one of the shops. If they're buying duty-free alcohol, for example, or if they're a lady is in a shop looking at buying some clothing, for example, they tend to take a long time to disengage from that shopping experience and engage in the evacuation experience. And one of the important things is that you have well-trained crew who can intervene and reduce the time it takes people to react. So when you have well-trained crew who react quickly when the alarm is sounded, and they come in and they interact with the passengers and they get the passengers to move to the assembly stations, that can reduce the response time quite a lot. But we find some passengers will not want to react to the crew very quickly. They continue doing their shopping, for example. So in those cases, you have to have very good procedures on board the ship. So for example, you close the shop, you close the tills so that they can't purchase anything. They can't even think they're going to purchase anything because they close the tills. In situations where you have crew involved, for example, on board an aircraft or on a train or on a ship, the crew are actually a very important safety feature of the transport mode. Okay, so in fact they are probably the most important safety feature. So it's very important that you have well-trained crew that know how to react during a situation. Ships are very confusing environments. I've traveled on many ships and I'm accustomed to ships, but it takes me several days to get used to the layout of a very large cruise ship. So the very nature of the ship's interior are very disorientating. Usually when you're inside the ship, there's no windows, you can't see where you are. Often you don't know which deck you're on. Sometimes you don't even know if you're facing forward or aft. So it's a very confusing environment, and most passengers that go on board a ship are confused, they're disorientated, and it takes them quite some time before they become accustomed to the layout of the vessel. And that's why it's very important that the crew are well trained in emergency procedures so they can help the passengers get to the assembly stations on board the ship. So the crew are very, very important aspects. And if the crew are not well trained, then you will have disasters happening in the event of an accident. Another interesting study we did as part of BESIQ was we were studying how people reacted in the London 7/7 terrorist bombings on the underground. And we have photographs similar to the photographs from Daegu of inside the trains as the trains are filling with smoke. And when you look at the photographs, you could not tell the difference between Korea and London. The train is filling with smoke and people are still sitting waiting to be told what to do, just like happened in Korea. So there's an example where two very different social cultures, Korea and the United Kingdom, it looks like they were behaving in a very similar way in this underground environment. And so from that point, I began to become interested in, does culture influence the way people behave? So we decided on studying university library buildings, and then we chose the United Kingdom, we chose the Czech Republic, we chose Poland, and we chose Turkey. And within the European confines, these were as different a culture that we could find. And so we set up the experiment in libraries in these 4 countries, and we ran an evacuation unannounced, so people had no idea this was going to be an alarm. What we found was so surprising. We expected that the UK would be the best and they would have the best reaction because the people in the UK are well disciplined and they're used to following instructions and all that. But in fact, it was the second worst. And the results from Turkey, which we expected to be the worst, was actually the best. And what I mean by the best was they reacted most quickly. So if you look at the videos, you see the people in the Turkish example, when they hear the alarm, they don't stop to check, to ask people, is this for real, is this a false alarm? They don't pack their bags. As soon as they hear the alarm, they got up and they started to evacuate. Whereas in the UK, for example, people took a long time, they went to check, they wanted to make sure, ask their friends, should we go, and then they pack everything away. And the worst example was in the Czech Republic. In the Czech Republic, people took so long, it was unbelievable. It was like they were going to stay there forever. And they took a really long time. Really long time. And it was only when, in fact, they ignored the alarm completely. And it was only when an authority figure came and told them to go, they would get up and go. So what the BESIQ project told us was that social culture can have a big influence on how quickly people react and respond. The way people respond to an alarm often depends on whether they're in groups of people or individually by themselves. People who tend to be by themselves will tend to perhaps react quicker. If you have a larger group of people, then perhaps the larger group of people, if one person reacts in the large group, then the others will tend to follow that. But often it's the time it takes for the first person to react. And so it could be, there's been some experiments done, quite famous experiments, where they have groups of people and they plant somebody in there who reacts very quickly, and then everyone will react. And in other situations where when no one reacts quickly, the group takes a long time. I think in the Seawall tragedy, the Korean ferry disaster, I think the situation there, the people didn't react quickly, primarily because they were told not to react. They were told to stay in their cabins. Now, the population, the vast majority of people on the ship were school children. Now, school children will tend to respect authority. So if an authority figure, such as the captain, says stay in your cabins, then those children are likely to listen to that and respect that and follow those instructions. And that is true, I believe, whether they were Korean children or American children or British children. You will tend to respond to an authority figure. And an authority figure giving you instructions, you will tend to follow, especially if you are junior. If you're a junior, if you're a younger person, if you're a junior person. And I'll give you an example of this. In the World Trade Center evacuation, during the evacuation of the South Tower, this is the second tower that was hit, not the first one, it was the second one to be hit, the South Tower. People started to evacuate that building, even though that building wasn't hit. And the authorities got on the PA system, the public address system, and told them that this building is not under threat, there is no need to evacuate. So some people said, we don't have to evacuate, and they went back to the offices. Now, other people ignored that and they continued to evacuate, but these were adults. But the important thing here is that even some adults listened to what the authority figure was saying and they went back to the office. So the key thing there is to give the correct instructions, to understand the implications of the disaster situation you're in, to understand what happens when a ship begins to heel over, and to appreciate how important it is to get people to an assembly point, to a point where they can easily evacuate the ship as quickly as possible. Once the ship starts taking on a heel, when it starts heeling over, listing over, once the angle starts to increase, it becomes very difficult to move. And so it becomes very important that you get the passengers to the place where they can evacuate the assembly as quickly as possible before the ship heels over too far. And so instead of giving the order, stay in your cabin, the order should have been, start the assembly process. Don't evacuate the ship yet until the captain says to evacuate, but start the assembly process. Get people from where it's difficult to evacuate to the point where it's easier to evacuate. And this was not only on the seawall, on the Costa Concordia in Europe, in Italy. It was the same mistake that the captain made. Instead of telling the passengers to assemble, not to evacuate, but to assemble very early, he made it difficult for the passengers to get to a point of safety where they could then evacuate. So the Costa Concordia and the seawall were very similar types of situations in terms of the evacuation dynamics and in terms of the mistakes that the crew made. So I don't think this is a problem unique to Korea. The European, a major ship company, and the Costa Concordia, they made the same types of errors. And I think it's an indication of poor training and poor understanding of the severity of these evacuation situations, about how difficult it would be to start the evacuation process if you wait too long. And so, these are some of the things that I think are the lessons that have to be learned, not only from the seawall, but also from the Costa Concordia. What we have to try and understand is, what is the reluctance? Why are the captains reluctant to start the assembly process as early as possible when they know they have a serious situation developing? What is it that is preventing them from wanting to give the order to assemble? I don't mean to evacuate the vessel, but to assemble the passengers in a place of safety. Perhaps the captains are concerned that maybe if we don't have to evacuate, the passengers will be very upset because I've made an assembly. I've made them assemble. And then maybe the company will be upset because we've upset the passengers. But if that is the problem, then that should really be completely ignored, because the safety of the passengers is the first priority of the captain. And so, even if the evacuation is not needed, the safety comes first, and it becomes very important to have this assembly done as quickly as possible. Because, as I say, if the ship starts taking on a heel, it becomes almost impossible. When the ship is at 20 degrees, this passageway is almost like a mountain you have to climb. It becomes very difficult to get from one point of the ship to the other. So it's very important that the captains know to start the assembly process as quickly as possible, as soon as possible. So I think training is the key thing here, and appreciation that sometimes they might get it wrong and they call an assembly when it's not really necessary, but it's better to be safe. And so I think that's the best way to do it. I know what I would do. If I was on a ship and the ship started to heel and I was told to stay where I am, there's no way in the world I'm going to stay where I am. I'm going to get my family and we're going to get to a place of safety, the assembly station, as quickly as possible. There's no way I'm going to wait. That's what I would do. I think the best thing that you can do for people is give them as much information as possible. So in the event of an emergency situation, you should be telling the people the truth about the situation, giving them information that they will find useful to make their own decisions. People are not stupid. And so people will make the right types of decisions if you give them truthful information and don't lie to the people and say, it's okay, there's nothing wrong, when there is something wrong. If you want them to evacuate, you need to tell them that they have to evacuate. You need to give them the sufficient information so that you don't cause people to be over anxious, but you provide them with enough information that they make the right decisions. If you don't give people the right information, they can't make the right decisions. And this is where I think in many situations authorities don't give people the correct information because they're scared of panic. And panic, as I said before, very rarely happens. And it's down to this misunderstanding of the myth of panic. So to get the best results, you need to give people the correct amount of information. Not too much information, because they can't process it. You've got to give them the right amount of information that's relevant. And then people will make good decisions on the whole. Not always, but on the whole.